It has been an interesting week here on Florida's Space Coast and in the undisclosed studio location for the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Of course, we had thunderstorms and just pounding rain for 3 or 4 days as what would have been, I guess, the second tropical system of the season. Tropical storm, I don't remember what the B storm would have been named, but it would have been the second one because the one that moved on shore in Texas last week officially became the first tropical disturbance of the season. Regardless of what the media tries to tell you, that isn't particularly early. Hurricane season officially starts June 1st of every year. However, it's not unusual to have hurricanes and tropical storms way earlier. In fact, the earliest I can remember is we had the A-named storm in January one year. And while that might have been more of a extremely late end to the previous hurricane season, it officially counted as the first storm of that year's hurricane season. And we have had plenty of tropical storms form up in, April and May. So it's actually been relatively quiet out there in the tropics, considering that the doom and gloom media has been trying to tell you that the ocean temperatures are so hot, they've never been hotter, that we're all going to die and that Florida is probably already underwater. I can assure you that it is hot here in Florida, but it is absolutely no different than any of the other years that I've witnessed living here on Florida's Space Coast. But I digress. This is a Bitcoin podcast, and we have a lot of Bitcoin news to talk about, not the least of which is the price, which has a lot of normies and a lot of newcomers really worried. But if you are taking advantage of the BTFD strategy, then in addition to your DCA Wednesday stack being cheaper than the week before that, today Bitcoin is even cheaper still. And of course, today is also late. It is not the normal Wednesday episode that we do for DCA Wednesday. If you follow me on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod, you would have known that because as I mentioned, I had a family member and their friends go over to Thailand and Japan for a couple weeks, and they came home with some upper respiratory illness that I've apparently never had because I have been sick for the last 2 weeks solid. But last Wednesday, just a few days ago, Wednesday, June 19th, I wasn't so sick that I couldn't get out of bed, but I was so sick that I could not talk for more than 2 or 3 words without just getting into a really heavy-duty coughing fit. And nobody got time to hear that. This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy. Hello, you sexy sat stackers, and welcome to the latest episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. As usual, I am Chris, and as I alluded to in the intro, today is not Wednesday, July 19th, 2024. So this is our makeup DCA Wednesday episode. Again, if you're following me on Twitter, you would have known that the episode was going to be late. As always, we did our stack on Wednesday, July 19th, as we always do, as we always have every Wednesday since we began our DCA Wednesday episode series. So we'll get into that here in just a little bit. There's actually a lot of news to get in today. But before we do any of that, let's take a look at the vital statistics. Of course, the vital statistics are a little different because at the time of this recording, we're many blocks ahead of where we were when I did my DCA Wednesday stack. But also, the Bitcoin price is about $4,000 per Bitcoin cheaper than it was on DCA Wednesday. At the time of this recording, however, we are at a block height of 849,382, and Bitcoin is ringing in at $60,480 US, or 1,653 sats per US dollar per cuck buck, and that brings Bitcoin's market capitalization in US dollar terms to $1.19 trillion. That is significantly cheaper than it was 2 DCA Wednesdays ago, and even cheaper than it would have been had I gotten this recording out on time for DCA Wednesday. Looking at the statistics that I took a quick screenshot when I did my purchase, so I'd have all of this information when I finally was feeling good enough to hit record and do this podcast. At the time we made our stack, we were at block height 848,683, and Bitcoin is ringing in a little over 64,000. I believe it was 64,870. Well, that's exactly what it was when I took that screenshot. And Bitcoin had a market cap of 1.28 trillion, but that is old news. TikTok next block and time certainly flies. For those of you who value your wealth in shiny yellow rocks, right now it will cost you 26.1 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin. And that means Bitcoin has just 7.48% of gold's market cap. So for those of you who are hoping that Bitcoin will become just as valuable as the electronic version of gold one day, Bitcoin still has more than 10x to go before we take that metric. And obviously, I believe Bitcoin's going to go a heck of a lot higher as we achieve hyper-Bitcoinization and nation states, central banks, etc., start holding Bitcoin. Of course, we're already heading in that direction with a vengeance, with Wall Street and mainstream finance, traditional finance getting increasingly more involved in the Bitcoin space. But I digress. We also had a difficulty retarget since we've spoken. I guess if I would have done DCA Wednesday episode on time, we would have been about a day away from a difficulty adjustment. At the time, it was looking like we were going to have possibly a slight difficulty decrease because blocks were coming in at like 9 minutes and 59 seconds, which is pretty darn close to that 10-minute average that the Bitcoin Core protocol shoots for. As it turns out, we had basically no change whatsoever. Officially, according to Clark Moody's dashboard, it was a 0.0% difficulty increase. Currently, we're 1,370 blocks away from the next difficulty adjustment, which is estimated to be on July 4th, so Independence Day here in the United States. And that's looking like it's going to be a big decrease. Clark Moody's dashboard saying that's going to be a decrease of 4.4% because blocks are dragging right now. The average block time this difficulty epoch is only 10 minutes, or it's taking 10 minutes and 28 seconds. And that isn't a huge difference if you're just a pleb and you're making transactions. The difference between a 10-minute block and a 10-minute and 28-second block, if you're trying to make a payment with Bitcoin or move some Bitcoin to your hardware wallet, it's negligible. But if you're a commercial miner and or even a pleb mining at home in your garage, it means that you'll earn about 4% or so less Bitcoin each day for your mining efforts. Still relatively insignificant considering we have seen gigantic difficulty increases. Correction, you're going to be making about 4% more Bitcoin. I'm looking at that minus and thinking, hey, minus, you'll be making less money. But it's a decrease in difficulty, which means you'll be making about 4% more. Still, small potatoes when you're talking sats, regardless of what you're mining with. Of course, the bigger your mining operation, the more that each percent really matters. But if you're just a pleb and you have an Antminer S9 or S19 in your garage, or you've got one of the even smaller miners, like the bit axes, for example, then you're barely even going to notice the difference in satoshis that you receive each day. All right, that metric that has been my favorite metric to follow throughout all of this podcast history, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is actually down quite a bit since last DCA Wednesday, it's down since when I should have done DCA Wednesday, and down even more since a week ago, the DCA Wednesday prior to that. Transactions are still zooming in quite a bit at 6.18 transactions per second. Of course, prior to Taproot and the emergence of all the on-network spam, the BRC20 tokens, the ordinals, inscriptions, etc. Anytime we saw more than 3 transactions per second, actually anytime we saw more than about 3.25 transactions per second, that meant there was just a boatload of on-chain activity, and that usually corresponded to an increase, a price run in Bitcoin's US dollar value. That's a little bit out the window since we have so much so many noise transactions, so much in the way of spam right now. But if you kind of look at the adjusted version of those numbers, where we'd seen 7 or 8 transactions per second coming in when Bitcoin was really on a run, obviously you can tell that 6.8 transactions per second is significantly less than that, and it corresponds to Bitcoin's price being down. So despite the fact the numbers have changed a bit, the meaning of those numbers really hasn't. For example, last DCA Wednesday, Bitcoin transactions were having 7.48 transactions per second. So more than one transaction, like 1.4 transactions per second fewer on average are coming in right now. And while this isn't any official TA, that's not any kind of transaction analysis I've really heard anybody get into or talk about, it It has been useful, at least as an observation, as an anecdotal uh, observation. They say causation and correlation are not related. Causation isn't correlation is not necessarily causation. But in the almost 3 years we've been doing this podcast now, just my general observation has been when average transaction volume is up, the price has been up as well. And when the transaction volume was tapering off, there was usually a decrease in Bitcoin price. And right now, that holds true as well. Where was I? I've kind of got two sets of windows open. I have my notes that I prepared for last DCA Wednesday, which are moot now because it's several days later. And then I've got Clark Moody's dashboard and mempool.space open. So I'm kind of comparing where we were last DCA Wednesday with where we are now. And I'm looking at on-chain transaction, and Clark Moody's mempool is showing that we've got a significant decrease in the number of transactions in his mempool over last week. Currently, at this moment in time, there are 134,000 transactions pending in Clark Moody's mempool, and mempool.space, of course, has a much larger mempool. The numbers are usually a lot higher. But still, those numbers are down significantly since last DCA Wednesday as well, with mempool.space showing 183,059 transactions in their mempool. And as a result, the fee that it's going to cost you to send an on-chain transaction right now are down significantly from where they've been for months, actually. Clark Moody's dashboard is saying if you have a priority transaction that you want to guarantee is in the next block, that you should include a fee of 20 sats per VByte to do so, but a fee of just 8 sats per VByte should be mined within a day, and a fee of just 7 sats per VByte will be mined within a week, again, according to Clark Moody's dashboard fee estimator. Mempool.space is telling a radically different story. They're saying that even a high priority transaction only needs a fee of 8 sats per VByte to be mined in the next block or so, and that works out to just 68 cents. That is definitely the cheapest we've seen in a long time. So if you were one of those people that was panicking when fees were kind of going through the roof, and you were worried that you wouldn't be able to spend some of your UTXOs because you were worried they would turn into dust, now might be the time. Looking at the very last block that came in about 7 minutes ago now, block 849,383, the fee range was anywhere between 8 sats per VByte and 29,776 sats per VByte. Somebody way overpaid. Because the highest fee paid in the block prior to that were only 302 sats per VByte. And there's always people that just way overpay. Sometimes it's because they have a wallet that won't let them set their own fee, or a wallet that way overestimates their fee. Or sometimes they just want to absolutely guarantee that it's mined like right now, and so they don't care about spending 29,000 sats, especially if they're transferring millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't care. That's a very tiny percentage of the transaction value. But for us plebs, mempool.space is saying that a low, medium, or high priority transaction all should have a fee of 8 sats per VByte. And if you have a no priority transaction fee, they're saying that you can have a fee as low as 4 sats per VByte, and it will be mined in a week. I'm not sure I'd trust that. If I wanted to consolidate some transactions tonight, I probably wouldn't set 8 sats per VByte. I might set 6 or 7. Scrolling back through the block explorer on mempool.space, if you go back about an hour and a half, actually just a little over an hour, block 849,380, the cheapest fees that were mined on that block were 7 sats per VByte. And the 3 or 4 blocks before that all had 7 sat per VByte fees, but I'm not seeing anything cheaper than 7 sats per VByte. Of course, as it gets later, we head into the nighttime in Europe and England, Europe, and the United States. Usually, the mempool tends to clear out even more, and fees diminish even more so. But hey, 8 sats per VByte, 68 cents for an unconfiscatable, immutable transaction, a permissionless transaction anywhere in the world, darn near instantaneously. 68 cents is a freaking bargain. I mean, go to Western Union or to your bank, ask to send a wire transfer for 68 cents, and watch them laugh or call the police and have you removed from the property, because that ain't going to happen. So it is important to point out that if you don't know what I'm talking about, or you're not really familiar with the concept of fee estimation, if you're not using a wallet that if you're not advanced enough that you're using a wallet that gives you, that kind of control over your transaction, for example, you do what you feel comfortable doing. But I would recommend using a wallet not using any wallet that won't let you set your fee. Some wallets will let you set a fee range. They'll give you an option like, high priority, low priority, or medium priority. And then they'll estimate the fee based on that. Others will let you set any fee you want. And they'll let you fat finger it and way overpay. We saw somebody pay over $1 million for a transaction on more than one occasion. And they'll also let you underpay to the extent that you could put so low a fee that your transaction will never get mined. Fortunately, most of the better wallets out there will let you bump that fee if the transaction isn't getting confirmed fast enough, whether it's taking longer than you anticipated or whether you just change your mind. And now a transaction that wasn't a high priority transaction when you sent it is now a priority transaction. You can use replace by fee or child pays for parent to bump that fee or rebroadcast a different transaction at a higher fee rate. But again, don't try and roll your own, as they say. Make sure you understand what you're doing before you take the leap and start. Don't go playing around with technology you don't fully understand. So if you're not comfortable and you want to use a wallet that's a little more pedestrian, a wallet that's a little more of a newbie wallet that makes those decisions for you, by all means, as long as you're using a well-known wallet, not some fly-by-night wallet you've never heard of. You use the technology level that you feel comfortable using. Okay. Before we get into the news and before we get into our DCA Wednesday stack, which of course we already made, I want to take a second to thank those of you listening on your favorite podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Fountain, for example, will even let you earn sats just for listening to your favorite podcasts. And of course, they let you support your favorite podcast through the value for value model, where you determine how much value I'm providing you, and then you can either stream sats on a per minute basis. If you feel like I'm giving you 1 Satoshi per minute worth of value for listening to this podcast, you can send me 1 Satoshi per minute. If you think this podcast is worth 10 sats per minute, you can do that as well. The method that most podcasts prefer, and that I actually prefer, is the boosting method, where sending a boost is basically sending a shout out, where you send a lightning message to your favorite podcast, letting us know what you think, just saying hi. And of course, because it's a lightning transaction, you're sending some sats to help support the podcast as well. And we do have one boost to read. It's from longtime supporter of the podcast, Leggy. Leggy sent 3,000 sats and said, "Let me try something, ... I'm not 100% certain what Leggy was getting ready to try because I haven't gotten a follow-up on that. But thank you for the sats, Leggy. And if you would send clarification in the form of a DM on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod, I'm curious, what were you trying and did it work? And that was for episode 166, Stormy Days and Submarines, which was June 12th. That was our DCA Wednesday stack number 151. So the most recent episode. Of course, when you do send a boost, I read them on the next episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Sorry that you had to wait over a week, Leggy, because this is the very next podcast. And in fact, it is the next DCA Wednesday podcast. I just am getting around to getting this out late. I'm still feeling a little run down. I'm just, in fact, I've had to pause once already because I didn't have a coughing fit. My throat isn't scratchy. I'm not coughing up a storm. But I got into a sneezing fit and was sneezing uncontrollably for about a minute. So if there's a break in the audio, I'll try and patch that up as best I can. But I've already had to hit pause just because I'm still sick. I have no idea what this is. It's been weeks. Normally, if you get a cold or even the flu, it doesn't last this long. So part of it's just allergies. We had a lot of rain and it's, a lot of things are in bloom, but that's just Florida. Stuff blooms year round here. And I've never really had super bad allergies, or at least I didn't until I moved to Florida a decade or so ago. But nothing like this year. So forgive me if it gets a little rough. I've already had to hit pause once. Hopefully I won't have to do so again. I'm also going to keep this episode short and sweet because we're going to speak again, hopefully just in another 2 days on Wednesday for our next DCA Wednesday episode. So I have a lot of things I want to talk about on that episode, and I don't want to spoil them. I don't want to spoil next week's episode by getting into too much of it in advance. But either way, thank you to all of you listening, regardless of where you're listening from. Thank you, Leggy, for that boost. Thank you as usual. Leggy's been just a fantastic supporter of this podcast. Not Leggy's first boost. So thank you to everybody listening, and thank you to those of you who have supported the podcast in the past and those who continue to do so. Of course, one of the fastest and easiest ways you can support the podcast without even using the value for value model, streaming or boosting sats, is just helping us feed that algorithm monster. For example, I mentioned Twitter. Our podcast Twitter file or X feed is at BTC Bulletin Pod, like at Bitcoin Bulletin Pod, but it's abbreviated at BTC Bulletin Pod. And we don't have a whole lot of people following us on Twitter. So the more people that do follow us on Twitter, the more likely our tweets are to be featured in somebody's feed, or, and the more likely they are to maybe even find out about Bitcoin in the first place, or to be orange pilled, because most plebs hear about Bitcoin for 2 or 3 times before they finally go all in, before they finally take that orange pill and become a Bitcoiner. So maybe there's someone out there who's heard about Bitcoin, they're Bitcoin curious, and they see my tweets and they realize that, oh, you can buy just $20 a week worth of Bitcoin, and you can do it just once a week and build a nice stack of sats. And maybe you following us on Twitter will be what it takes to help orange pill somebody. It's just that easy. Of course, the other way you can help support the podcast is, depending on which podcast app you are listening to, liking, rating, reviewing the podcast, helps feed that algorithm monster as well. For example, if you're listening on Spotify, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is select the number of stars you would like to rate the podcast. You just click on the, click on the 3 dots next to the settings gear or whatever, and click on rate the show. And then it shows like 5 blank stars, and you just tap on the number of stars you want. And voila, you've given the podcast a rating, and that helps feed that algorithm monster. Of course, on Apple Podcasts, if you used to have automatic downloads enabled when you subscribe to a podcast and you're following a podcast, which is cool, because if you're traveling and you've got a 4-hour cross-country flight, or heaven forbid, a 10 or 11-hour flight, even longer flight if you're flying across the Pacific or to Australia, and you don't have internet, or you have the Wi-Fi in the airplane, but they won't let you download any media. They'll just let you send texts and maybe watch their free TV channel. It's nice to have a bunch of podcasts ready to go, all your favorite podcasts. And Apple, at the beginning of the year, began removing automatic downloads from anybody who hadn't listened to more than 2 episodes a week of a particular podcast. And so, we only put out 1 podcast a week on average. And even if we put out 2, that's still not more than 2. So chances are Apple has removed your automatic downloads if you haven't re-enabled them. And so if you are a fan of this podcast, you listen regularly, please make sure you have automatic downloads enabled. That helps feed that algorithm monster. And you'll have our latest podcast automatically in your podcast app when you have time and you decide that you want to listen to a podcast or 2. All right. Speaking of you, the listener, our geographic distribution of listeners remains pretty much the same as it's been. We do have a bit of a change this week. The first change in our top 10 listeners by country is the United States has moved up just a tiny bit. It's always been where more than half of you are listening from the United States, but there's almost an extra full percent of you now listening from the United States. So we have either picked up a U.S. listener or dropped a listener from somewhere else, because now about 1% more of you are listening from the United States. For the last several weeks, so pretty much as usual, Argentina remains number 2. So muchas gracias, amigos in Argentina. As usual, Germany remains number 3. So Dankeschön, mein Freund in Deutschland. Also, as usual, Canada is remaining number 4. The percentages for Argentina, Germany, and Canada are rock solid. They haven't changed. So thank you to those of you listening up north, where the weather is probably absolutely gorgeous right now. Number 5 remains completely unchanged as well, and that's Luxembourg. So Morien, to those of you who speak Luxembourgish listening in Morien, or Danke, mein Freund in Luxembourg. Number 6 is still unchanged as well. That's Spain. And so muchas gracias, amigos in Spain, for listening. Here's where one of the changes is. And this is actually a fairly significant change, because the United Kingdom has completely dropped out of the top 10. Up until this week, number 7 was the United Kingdom, but now Venezuela has moved into the number 7 spot. And that's kind of, Venezuela had been higher up the charts in the past. So it's kind of things going back to the way they had been. So number 7 is Venezuela. So muchas gracias, amigos in Venezuela. Colombia has moved up a spot from number 9 to number 8. So again, muchas gracias, amigos in Colombia. Mexico, which had just barely moved into the top 10 a couple of weeks ago, has moved up from number 10 to number 9. So that's really cool. Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, when Mexico had been lurking at number 11 for several months, I mentioned that it would only take maybe getting one or two more people, maybe a friend or a family member, and turn them on to this podcast in Mexico and help boost the rankings for Mexico. And not only did that happen with Mexico breaking into the top 10 a couple of weeks ago, now Mexico is on the move and is now number 9. So muchos gracias, amigos in Mexico. Thank you for listening. Thank you especially to the new people out there in Mexico that have just joined us, that have helped bump your country up to number 9. Number 10 is also a big change. Australia has moved up from number 11 and joins us in the top 10. And that's what officially dropped the United Kingdom out of the top 10, where they're still hanging in there at number 11, but just out of the top 10. So good day, mates. Thank you to everyone listening in Australia. Obviously, somebody in Australia either recommended the Bitcoin Bulletin podcast to a friend or family member, or maybe somebody in Australia just found the podcast on their own. But either way, enough new listeners have shown up that Australia has broken into the top 10 and is now the number 10 country for listenership by country. So thank you to all of you listening, regardless of where you're listening from. To my cousins across the pond in the United Kingdom, you're really close. You know, the United Kingdom had been in the top 10 for months. In fact, last week they were number 7. So this is actually a pretty big drop. I don't know. Maybe we got some loyal plebs in the United Kingdom who are just on vacation and they'll tune back in and bring the United Kingdom back into the top 10 next week. Or maybe we got the exact same number of listeners in the United Kingdom, but those of you listening in Australia and Mexico have just increased by such leaps and bounds that you bumped the United Kingdom out of the top 10. But again, thank you to everyone that's listening, regardless where you're at. It's really, really flattering to see that we have listeners all over the world, and we really do. You know, it isn't just the top 10 or 11 countries. I can see statistics that scroll on into the minutia where it's, you know, hundreds of a percent of listenership and where they're from. And we truly have an international audience, which I guess makes sense because Bitcoin is an international, it's an international language. It's an international monetary system. Bitcoin is for everyone. And this podcast is for everyone. It doesn't surprise me that the majority of my listeners are in the United States because I'm in the United States and this is an English language podcast. It's extremely flattering that we have so many people in Latin America, in Spanish speaking countries, because, you know, for example, Argentina and, you know, Venezuela are countries that have had their currency just, you know, devalued horrifically and, you know, just tremendously high, horrific inflation. And so those are countries that Bitcoin can be more valuable to people in the United States or Europe, where we still have a reasonably stable currency. Even with inflation raging in the United States and Europe, it's absolutely nothing like it has been in Argentina and Colombia. It is cool to see that Argentina clocked the first, I don't remember what the reporting period was, but it's the first quarter, the first month, or whatever it is, with zero inflation, as opposed to the hyperinflation that they had been experienced. So that is really awesome. But either way, you have always had Bitcoin to rely on. And I think it was one of the first podcasters I ever listened to. Wasn't really a podcaster. He did videos on YouTube. They were usually just his talks from Bitcoin conferences and things like that, meetups where they would record his talk and he'd put it on YouTube. But Andreas Antonopoulos, and if you're, you know, newer than say the class of 2016, maybe 2017, you might not know who Andreas Antonopoulos is. And if you don't know who Andreas Antonopoulos is, you know, go back to his YouTube channel and find Andreas Antonopoulos and watch some of his old videos, because even though they might have been in 2014 or 2015, what he said, none of that has changed. He talks about the technology behind Bitcoin, how the governments are useless to stop Bitcoin, and how, you know, Bitcoin is helping people in places like Argentina. In fact, this is what reminded me of Andreas, is he would say when he was talking to Bitcoiners at meetups in the United States, he'd have to explain to people why you need Bitcoin. And when he would go to Argentina, all he would have to explain is how you use Bitcoin. He said that people at his meetups would say, like, yeah, we know about Bitcoin. We like Bitcoin. We just don't know how to use it. So tell us how to use Bitcoin. Whereas in the United States and Europe at the time, you had to convince people to become interested in Bitcoin in general, because, you know, people have their euros or their dollars and their credit cards or their airline miles. And it just wasn't something that ever made it in anybody's, you know, that anybody really spent any significant amount of time thinking about. For example, even with 2% or 3% inflation in the United States for all those years, and that's of course the official numbers, which were always BS, but people just assumed that things got more expensive. Nobody stopped and thought that things aren't getting more expensive. An apple is still worth an apple. A Bitcoin is still worth a Bitcoin. The US dollar is getting less valuable, and that's why it takes more US dollars to go buy a Big Mac or to go buy a six-pack of beer or to buy a house or to buy a car. And it wasn't until more people started becoming Bitcoiners and then inflation started surging in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years that I think more people's eyes were open. More people were awakened to the fact that currencies don't have to lose value. The Keynesian BS about, if you don't have inflation, nobody will spend any money and economies will grind to a halt is complete BS. I mean, we had a gold standard in the United States for the first 200 years of its existence. We had almost no inflation for the vast majority of U.S. history until after 1971, when we officially abandoned the gold standard and started full-on money printing. And we had, the Industrial Revolution. We had, we had the invention of the airplane and, the space race. All kinds of huge technological innovations and expansions of the economy. Built the country from just some English colonies and a few swampy areas along the east coast of the United States to one of the biggest, most powerful countries in the world, and they did that all on a sound money system. So the hooey that we have to have deflation, obviously it's BS, but a lot of people just took it for granted. They just assume that things just get more expensive, and that's the way it is. And I think I've met a lot more people now, even people who aren't Bitcoiners, that they get it. That it's not things are getting more expensive. It's that the US dollar is turning into toilet paper, that the US dollar is becoming worth less and less. And even if they're not Bitcoiners yet, that sets you up to be one heck of a pre-coiner. Now all you have to do is realize that there's a solution. And hopefully we can spread that word to more people far and wide. And it's really cool that so many of you listening from so many places around the world, especially those places where Bitcoin has already been a tremendous help, where you needed it more than people did in places like the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. But the U.S., Europe, and so on are joining that club rapidly, and thank God for Bitcoin. All right, so the news that most plebs have been obsessing about, talking about recently, of course, is the Bitcoin price. And I want to remind you, I've spoke at length multiple times. It was 3 or 4 episodes ago when we had a pullback. Maybe it was more like a month or 2 ago. And Bitcoin had dropped back into the $58,000, $59,000 range, even lower than it is right now. And I went on for a fairly extensive period of time about how every bull run, Bitcoin has on average 7 pullbacks of greater than 30%, and that this is normal. And really, our bull run hadn't even started yet. We set a new all-time high before the halving, and that's completely odd. If things had followed the pattern that they've always followed through Bitcoin's previous halvings, if things had rhymed more closely or repeated, we'd just now be starting to tick back up towards the new all-time high, and we shouldn't eclipse a new all-time high until sometime this fall. 6 months to a year after the halving before we set a new all-time high. So maybe October, November, or December would have been the first time we should have broken $69,000. Of course, we had a good reason, to set a new all-time high because, the ETFs were approved and more companies started piling into Bitcoin, more normies started piling into Bitcoin. So we got kind of a kickstart a little bit early. And then, some of that wore off right after the ETF hype. We had the sell the news event. And we had another big run up, not quite to another new all-time high, but pretty close in the 70s again. And then we've had a sell-off, and we've had plenty of reasons, why there should be a sell-off, not the least of which is the fact that Bitcoin shouldn't necessarily have launched as high as it did so fast. That this is an unusual, being as high as Bitcoin is at this stage in the cycle is that's the unusual part. Not Bitcoin retracing to $58,000, $59,000 or $60,000 or so. Mastermind, and he's at Mastermind USA on Twitter, sometimes quite a controversial account. I don't mean controversial like American Hodl, but controversial in other ways. Posted just about 4 hours now. He tweeted, "Newbie, why is Bitcoin dumping? ? Oh geez. And then he's got a Larry David gif. Says, nobody gives an F. And I have a little bit slightly different take. It's not that nobody gives an F. It's that you shouldn't be surprised. But more importantly than that, zoom the F out. If you look at Bitcoin, if you look at what Bitcoin's done, even if you completely discount the huge ETF run up, the big ETF pump we had, and you just look what Bitcoin's done in the last year and draw a straight line from where we started the year to where we are now, completely cut out that run up to 74,000. Bitcoin started the year around 25,000. I think the low in the last 365 days, officially according to the source I'm looking at, was 24,900. Bitcoin's up almost 100%, almost double in the last year. And if you zoom out even further, that trend continues as well. Remember, Bitcoin goes up and to the right. And as Adam Meister at Tech Vault always says, Bitcoin is for people's strong hands and long-term thinking. That Bitcoin goes up and Bitcoin goes down. We have these 4-year cycles where Bitcoin screams way up into the stratosphere and then crashes way back down, sometimes as much as 60, 70, 80%. But if you zoom out, instead of being a huge peak and a huge crash, what you get are stair steps up and to the right. You go two steps forward and 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But at the end of that, you're 3 steps higher than where you were. And Bitcoin, as nascent as it is still, because you are still early, it can be pretty volatile. And that's just part of price discovery. And we're going to continue going through price discovery until pretty much everyone's using it, or maybe when we get as large as gold and Bitcoin has become as mainstream as gold, maybe Bitcoin will be a little more stable. But right now, we have a bunch of newbies FOMO in, and then we have a bunch of newbies get scared and dump. And just because those newbies might be more traditional financial investors with more money doesn't mean they don't behave the same as the average newbie does. So be patient. This is not unusual. If anything was unusual, it was Bitcoin running up as fast as it had. Had we repeated the last several cycles, Bitcoin would not be anywhere near it is until sometime this fall. After every halving in the past, we've seen Bitcoin go down a little bit and then gradually slope back up. Like I remember, was it the 2016 halving? It wasn't until the summer of 2017. I mean, a full year, more than a full year later, that Bitcoin really started going crazy. I mean, it blew past 1,000 sometime in like the spring of 2017. And then by August of 2017, it blew by like 4,000. And then by like November, we were in the teens. And then December, it hit like 17,000, almost 20,000 before it retraced. And we had the next Bitcoin winter, the next bear market. But that's just the way Bitcoin rolls. So for those of you worried about the price, the only thing you should be focusing on the price for is that we're going to buy more sats now than we were able to. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, and this is going to be the first, well, I've already made the stacks. This was the first time we've stacked 30,000 sats for a $20 investment in more than a month, like a month and a half. So Bitcoin is on sale, and that's a good thing because, quite frankly, I was worried, that maybe everyone gets that. Have I stacked enough? Have I stacked as hard as I should have? FOMO. And I think, yeah, I've stacked as hard as I could have. Maybe not the $20 a week that I'm doing for the podcast, but that's not the only involvement I have in Bitcoin. That's something I chose just for this podcast, for educational purposes and entertainment purposes, so that that I could demonstrate the power of dollar cost averaging and how you weren't late, and how even if you only had $20 a week, you could still build an appreciable stack of Satoshis if you just give it time. That long-term thinking, that long-term horizon Adam Meister talks about. Many of my previous podcasts, I said that if you're going to get into Bitcoin, you need to have a 10-year horizon. Bare minimum, you should buy Bitcoin and not even pay attention to the price for one full cycle. So if you're class of 2020, you're not there yet. But relax, zoom out. If it looks like the price is down, that's an indication to me that I need to stack. That it's time to be TFD, to buy the freaking dip. Okay, I am getting off on a major tangent here. I guess the only other thing I wanted to talk about besides the price was there's two things. One of the things that has made the news, and this may or may not have anything to do with the price decline, but it quite possibly could, was it was reported that Germany has begun dumping several $billion worth of Bitcoin that they had seized from an online streaming service, a pirated music streaming service or movie streaming service, and that they had moved like $2.5 billion worth of Bitcoin to exchanges and started dumping it. Obviously, if that were the case and more Bitcoin floods the market, that just like when Bitcoin, when US dollars pour in and Bitcoin gets taken off of the exchanges, that runs the price up, supply and demand. When Bitcoin floods the exchanges and people are trying to sell Bitcoin for US dollars, that has a tendency to depress the price. So it's a distinct possibility that that was the case. And of course, that had some knock-on effects because since the price started going down, the normies panic. People start selling the ETFs, and price action follows price action, and you get another pullback. I want to emphasize that none of this freaking matters, with the minor exception that we're able to buy more Bitcoin for every dollar we convert to Bitcoin today than we were just the other day. So zoom out and remember, when Bitcoin's 100,000 a Bitcoin, 200,000 a Bitcoin, $1 million a Bitcoin, buying at $60,000 or $64,000, it's all going to seem like you bought really cheap. But when Bitcoin does go to those prices, you're going to wish you'd stacked more at this price. Even if you don't have the ability to stack more, you always feel like my stack isn't big enough. Even if you've got 2 or 3 whole Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin or 100 Bitcoin, even if you're Michael Saylor and he's got thousands of Bitcoin, he doesn't think he has enough. And right now you have the opportunity to stack more Bitcoin for the same amount of fiat than you did last week. Speaking of Michael Saylor, there's another Michael out there who rumor has it is getting into Bitcoin, and that's Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computer. He raised some eyebrows on Thursday and Friday with a series of tweets. On Thursday, he tweeted simply, "Scarcity creates value," and then Michael Saylor replied to him about Bitcoin. And then the next day, on Friday, he retweeted a meme of the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street. C is for cookie, it's good enough for me. Except for he's eating Bitcoin, like nom nom nomming on Bitcoin. And Michael Dell tweeted that. This is a great account to follow, at me Cookie Monster. Very entertaining with a crying, laughy face. But people are noticing that it was another Bitcoin tweet. More people thinking that maybe Michael Saylor or someone has orange-pilled Michael Dell, and that he's going to start following the Saylor plan and aping his corporate cash pile into Bitcoin to help preserve that melting iceberg. And this is a big deal because if he does, Dell is a significantly bigger company than MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy, for example, has a market capitalization of just $24 billion. And that makes it the 793rd biggest company in the world by market cap. That puts his company basically in the minnow pool as far as companies go. Of course, his Bitcoin holdings, he's a whale. He's a whale, his company's a whale. But the market cap of his company, he's just a minnow. And that's even after the market cap of his company has shot through the roof because of his Bitcoin strategy. So, his market cap was even smaller before he bought billions of dollars of the Bitcoin. But even so, he has a $24 billion market cap. Dell has a $98 billion market cap, almost about 4 times bigger than MicroStrategy. And perhaps as important or more important, Dell's cash on hand, the pile of fiat sitting on their balance sheet, is $7.36 billion. Dell has more than $7 billion in their melting ice cube. And that was what brought Michael Saylor and MicroStrategies into the Bitcoin sphere. Is he was looking for a way to preserve that cash pile, because on a good year, that stack of cash is getting 2% less valuable every year. But realistically, if you look at the official inflation and then you look at what inflation really is, if you go to the grocery store or have to move and buy a new home, your ice cube's melting significantly faster than that. In fact, Dell's cash value declined 14% year over year, in large part probably because of that inflation statistic. So if they want to preserve their cash, if they want to stem the melting of that iceberg, and if Michael Saylor really has orange-pilled Michael Dell, that could be the second major company. Again, a company 4 times larger than Microsoft or than MicroStrategy, following MicroStrategy's lead. So that's just speculation. And again, I'm not cheering on billionaires getting into Bitcoin, but if you are concerned about the price, remember, supply and demand says, because there's only going to ever be 21 million Bitcoin, if another billionaire or another huge corporation wants to ape in and buy a huge stash of Bitcoin, that means they're going to have to buy that Bitcoin from one of us because there just isn't enough to go around. And, I'm not selling my Bitcoin to MicroStrategy or to Dell Computer or to anyone ever. And they're going to have to find someone who's willing to sell. And the weak hands are going to get fewer and fewer. Every time we have a pullback, the weak hands get shaken out and they either leave and never come back, or they leave and then they learn their lesson. And when they come back, they're like, man, I was an idiot. I bought at 50, sold at 25, and now it's 75. And I'm I'm buying in way higher and have less Bitcoin than I did before. And they learn that lesson. So with every cycle, the weak hands, weak hands are only the new weak hands. They get shaken out, and many of them become the new strong hands. And you're going to have to convince them. Dell's going to have to convince them to sell them their Bitcoin. So kind of like with the GameStop short squeeze, where the hedge funds had to purchase GameStop to cover their shorts, which means they had to pay whatever the people that were holding GameStop demanded, drove the price of GameStop through the roof. Similar dynamic will happen with Bitcoin when we get more big money aping into Bitcoin, whether that be Dell Computer, some other big company, or another country. All right, on to what made Wednesday, not today, but Wednesday so special, and that was DCA Wednesday. For those of you who are just joining us, if this is the first time listening to the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast, thank you for listening. Welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us. I do apologize that it's not necessarily my best game face that I'm putting forward here because I am still a little under the weather. And for those of you who are regulars, I apologize you had to wait till today for Wednesday's episode. But Wednesday is when we do our DCA Wednesday series, and DCA is short for dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. For example, this is going to be our 150-second stack. We started almost 3 years ago on July 28th, 2021, and we chose our equal portion at just $20 so that anybody listening to this podcast should be able to come up with $20 a week. Maybe in some places that's more money than you might have. In other places, for other people, that's peanuts and we're not even worth your time. And maybe you're a Michael Saylor and you want to stack hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. Again, this is a you do you thing, but I wanted to create a strategy that the common man could relate to, that would prove that most people that are listening to this podcast, regardless of your financial situation, can still stack an appreciable stack of Bitcoin and get in before it's too late for as little as $20 a week. But again, you do you. Our regular interval, of course, is weekly on Wednesdays. And so, again, that's a you do you thing. Most people that DCA into anything, whether it's stocks, whether it's their IRAs, money market fund, whatever, they usually invest on paydays. So if you get paid every other Friday, once every 2 weeks, then maybe you DCA every other week, every other Friday. If you get paid weekly, if you're a gig worker and you just get paid when you get paid, then your DCA can be a little more irregular. But the idea behind regular intervals is that you don't try and time the market, and you don't second guess yourself. And just by buying at regular intervals, you end up with a solid cost basis, a nice cost. You buy the average price, basically. Sure, sometimes you buy the top, but you're also going to buy the bottom, and it all averages out better than those who try to time the market. Because the old adage goes, time in the markets beats timing the market every time it's tried. And that's certainly true with Bitcoin, because people that try and gamble with their Bitcoin get wrecked. Anyway, so far we've stacked 151 times. And in those 151 Wednesdays, we've converted 3,020 US dollars into a stack of 9,453,501 sats. Now, that's not even 0.1 Bitcoin. That's 0.01 Bitcoin. 9 million sats, as I like to refer to it. But if you remember, when we achieve hyper-Bitcoinization, there's only enough Bitcoin for everyone in the world to have about 125,000 Bitcoin. So, we've already just $20 a week accumulated about 10x more Bitcoin than the average person could ever hope to have when Bitcoin does become widely used around the world. And with as much Bitcoin has been lost, or with Bitcoin that's being soaked up by corporate treasuries or by governments one day, that's going to be even less Bitcoin available for the plebs. So I firmly believe the more stats you can stack, the better. If you're stacking more than $20 a week, maybe you've got, multiple Bitcoins, a whole Bitcoin, 5 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, whatever. Again, that's a you do you thing. But for you plebs listening out there who you think $20 a month is going to be a tough lift, if that just means that, maybe you don't go out to a movie one night, or you don't go out for beers after work one night, whatever. You quit smoking, quit drinking expensive liquors. Anybody, for the most part, listening to this podcast should be able to save that $20. And if you do that, if you did that 3 years ago, you'd have 9 million, almost 9.5 million sats. If you do it today, you're not too late. Again, this is not financial advice, but I think we've proven just anecdotally by stacking every week for almost 3 years now that's the case. And last Wednesday, while I was laying in bed, I grabbed my phone, I opened up Cash App, and I stacked $20 with a Bitcoin. At the time I did that, Bitcoin is worth $64,858, almost $5,000 more expensive than it currently is. But still, even at that price, we bought 30,143 sats, which was the first time in almost 2 months that we were able to stack that many sats for just $20 US. If you're just joining us today, you're going to get an even better deal. And even if you do stack with us every Wednesday, you can be TFD and pick up some cheap sats with Bitcoin on sale today. I do pick up sats from time to time that I don't include in our DCA Wednesday stack. My personal stash is completely separate than the DCA Wednesday stash because I want to keep the data pristine. I want to stack as many sats as I personally can. But for the purposes of demonstrating whether DCA was a good investment, a good strategy or not, I don't include that. We only talk about the sats that I stack on DCA Wednesday. And after last Wednesday's stack, that raised our stash to 9,483,644 sats, so a little over 30,000 sats more. It also increased our average cost basis by $109.35, but still dollar cost averaging the last 3 years, even though we bought all the way up to the all-time high, the previous all-time high of 69,000, all the way down to the bottom and all the way back up to where we are now, our average purchase price is still just $32,055.19. So if you're new to Bitcoin, if you just stacked for the first time or you've never stacked yet and you're panicking because the price of Bitcoin dropped from $72,000 down to $60,000, if you just maintain that long-term thinking and DCA, you have still stacked at an average price of $32,000, and that is pretty darn good. That's basically almost a 50% discount from where Bitcoin currently is. Not too shabby. And if Bitcoin hits $100,000 one day, that stack of 9 million sats is going to be worth $9,483.64, and that isn't too shabby at all. I mean, that's tripling your money, and that's with Bitcoin just not even doubling. Which I think is a no-brainer. Bitcoin's, in my humble opinion, is going to go a heck of a lot higher than 100,000 this bull run. If Bitcoin ultimately hits $1 million, that stack of just $20 a week, once a week, every Wednesday, will be worth $94,836.44, and that's without adding a single new Satoshi to your pile. Of course, we're going to keep stacking next Wednesday and every Wednesday as long as people are silly enough to sell us Satoshis for US dollars. And along those lines, we will see you again in just a couple of days. Today's Monday here in the United States, so just 2 more days for our next DCA Wednesday where we grow that stack together. But in the meantime, keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.